great privilege of introducing Pete Simpson, largely because I began pursuing him as a keynote speaker almost a year ago after taking his class, The Political Identity of Wyoming. And I'll get to that in a minute. But first, a little background on Pete. He was born Peter Coy Simpson for his grandfather on his mother's side, Peter Coy, who founded the town of Coy out here on the Tongue River, along with Acme, Monarch, Deeds. They were all coal towns, and his grandfather's family was in the coal business. Pete, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this history. Okay. But Pete was born and raised in Cody. He is one of two sons, the other being Senator Al, of Lorna Coy and Millward L. Simpson, a lawyer and businessman who was remembered more for his political career. He was both governor of Wyoming and a U.S. senator. Both parents worked in Cody. Lorna worked for the Cody Enterprise newspaper and for the local radio station, KODI. And together they ran the family-owned Cody Inn. Pete's great-grandparents, Maggie and John Simpson, plotted and named the town of Jackson. And another great-grandparent, Finn Burnett, was an advisor to Chief Washakie of the Shoshone tribe, and apparently knew Sacagawea, without whom none of us would have found our way out here. So, Pete is an historian himself, so a bit of family history was in order, I thought. Now on to Pete. He actually has 3 degrees in history, 2 from UW, and 1 from the University of Oregon in Eugene. He has spent most of his life in academia, mostly at the University of Wyoming, both teaching and as an administrator, with some stints in Casper and Sheridan, and most recently Powell, and probably a few other places around the state that I'm not aware of. Pete has tried his hand at politics. He ran for governor against Mike Sullivan and lost to the Democrats. That was the era when we were actually electing Democrats, especially for governors. There was a whole string of them. Pete served in the Wyoming legislature back in the 1980s, representing Sheridan County. But he'd rather write about politics. His thesis for his MA was about the first year of the Wyoming legislature. And as a dear friend of Pete's, who also took his class on the political identity of Wyoming, said one day, leaving from class, Pete is too nice a guy to be a politician. In that class, we discussed everything controversial that's ever happened in the state. Matthew Shepard, the Black 14 UW football team incident in 1969, and for those of you who aren't aware of it, 14 team members were kicked off the team for planning to wear black armbands at their upcoming game with Brigham Young in protest of the discriminatory policies of the university against blacks. We also discussed Medicaid expansion, a concealed weapons bill that was making its way through the legislature, Wyoming's energy policies and practices over the years, and my favorite, Wyoming's cowboy myth. Is it hindering us from getting ahead, both in Wyoming and outside Wyoming? We never resolved that one, and I'm counting on Pete to take it up where we left off. To sum up the class, these topics were all heavily charged and could have gotten out of hand if not for Pete's unique approach. He would introduce a topic, ask a few leading questions, and turn us loose, stepping in occasionally to bring us back on course or bring down the temperature in the room, as Pete described it. What Pete was really teaching us was civil discourse. And if you're familiar with the Pete Simpson Forum, a part of WyoFile's regular news offerings, this is what he does best. Pete is a statesman in the best sense of the word. He is a humanist and a gentleman and a storyteller and a very funny guy who happens to love Wyoming. He's also an incredible actor. I remember when he played Sheridan back in the day. And just last spring, he and Lynn, his wife, who's sitting right here, starred on Golden Pond on the Wyoming stage. They were just here a month or so ago to receive Sheridan's Lotus Award for their remarkable contributions to the performing arts in the Sheridan community. Although Cody is home to them, I know they consider Sheridan a second home, and we are glad to have both of them here tonight. I know Lynn has to listen to this all the time, but I love this man. Please welcome Pete Simpson.
That's very much like when Dad was given a great introduction. He used to tell this story. This is timely now. You've got to listen to this. And it's he said there was an old guy in Thermopolis who passed away, and his wife and son were sitting right at the front of the church. And the minister went on. He was new to town, and he wanted to ingratiate himself with the parishioners and citizens of Thermopolis. And he extolled the virtues of this man. He was a terrific family man. He loved his wife. He was a dynamic leader in the community. He was a good father. Finally, the wife nudged her son and said, "Go up and see if that's your dad in that casket." Well, you look like a fun group of people, and I'm always reminded of that cautionary. I see many of you, I haven't had a chance to take a drink yet, but I will as the evening goes on later. But you have to know, you don't have to drink to have fun. But why take a chance? This evening here, I'm proud to be here. And I want to tell you that I've become, by the way, Jillian, I was actually born here out on Saberton, in the old hospital in Saberton. And 6 months later went home. No, actually, I think it was 2. I don't remember. But it was shortly thereafter. Anyhow, but that historical review was astounding, and part of it true. So, it was wonderful to hear. I could hardly wait for it to keep up. But look, I'm proud to be here. I have had an association with the Powder River Basin Resource Council. Let me tell you when I started that. I started that in 1980 with Reed Zars, who was one of the early members, and I served in the legislature with one of the most imposing presences and one of the most influential women I've ever known, Lynn Dickey. And so, yes, she heard that. She was an amazing, remarkable gal, and I was not only associated with it, I went to the legislature as a perfect greenhorn in 1980, and the senior member of the delegation was a chap some of you might remember, Dr. Fen Downing. And Fen Downing was a great fellow, a good mentor, and a wit with a glint in his eye. I went there the first day, and he took me to the cloakroom in the House of Representatives, and he introduced me to representatives there, and I was impressed. And then he said, "And Pete, what do you think about the whiskey bill?" And I said, right off the top of my head, "Well, if we ought to pay it." He never let me live that all the years I was there, but I served with Carlton Perry and Tom Kinnison, and when the Etsy pipeline, if you can remember, one of your first victories, friends, on the PRBRC was the Etsy slurry pipeline. Does anybody remember that? Some of my good friends were involved in that, and I mean on the proponent side. You know, there was John Jenkins, there was Larry Larry Picari, and lots of, and none of them are here, are they? Anyhow, those guys were enthusiastic promoters. And so we had a really knockdown drag out about that. They were going to withdraw Little Horn and Madison Aquifer water and pump slurried coal to Nebraska power plants and beyond. And finally, Sarah Gorham was a part of the research, and Reed, and they were able to pull together just, I mean, working night and day, the flaws and the risks of doing that sort of thing. Later, by the way, it was by the Black Mesa storyline. I think maybe some of you might have remembered, or at least know about that, where you dragged out sort of dish rag coal the samples, and it took them forever to dry it out, and the company went broke because it was impossible to do. But there were environmental arguments about it. Well, when we brought it down, and Reed had armed me beautifully, and I even made a sort of a maiden voyage speech, and we killed the pipeline to the exasperation of Frank Odaz from Cody, but still, I wasn't up in Cody at the time. And so when it went down, Herschler, who was then governor, was pleased by that, so he invited me to the Wyoming State Bar Association roast of him. And it was a pleasure. And one of your former speakers here, Jerry Spence, was the chief roaster. And Spence gave Ed an unmerciful ride. He didn't understand the science. He never read a science book. He couldn't add 2 and 2. He was disregarding the poor environment in Nebraska, where they would become victims of smokestack industries, which was one of the promotional things. And he just gave you unmerciful, unshirted hell, as they would say. And old Ed was plenty up to anything like that. And Ed got up and said, I was thrilled with that, Jerry. And I can't tell you how wonderful it was to read your great book, Gunning for Justice. And he says, and I can hardly wait for the sequel, Shot Down on Appeal. And at the end of his time, he said, Jerry, you gotta know, pipelines don't vote, railroads do. Well, that was my initiation of PRVRC into good legislation and the work you do to influence policy in this state and the research you continue to do. And now you're 44 years old. That's early middle age. And you have a lot of life left in you, much to our gratification in the state of Wyoming. So I'm proud to be here, and I'm proud you asked me, Jerry, and I appreciate that. I have something to say here. Actually, I have another story to tell. Here we go. Yeah, but it's not. It's true. I like the Wyoming style that Herschler, that was evidenced by the Bar Association and the roast and those kinds of friendly things in a day when we could talk across the aisle to each other, joke with each other, share commonalities and still argue policy and differences. Anyhow, Mike Enzi was a brand new senator, and the Wyoming Association of Municipalities was meeting in Cody, and they had invited a kind of a controversial character, the head of the Urban League from New York City. But he was very clever, and he was very smart. And at the end of his statement, he said, I am so grateful to be in Wyoming, where these spaces are untrammeled, where the beauty of the country is so with us and on top of it. He said, because he said, in New York City, he said, no matter how far you run for 2 miles in any direction, you're still at the scene of the crime. And everybody laughed, and I thought, Mike has to come up after him, and I wonder what he'll say. And Mike said, Mr. So-and-so, we are pleased to have you here. We're a relatively small state, but we're friendly. In fact, in Wyoming, if you dial a wrong number, you still know who it is you're talking to. I thought that was a great response for Wyoming. Well, I want to acknowledge you, Jillian, for asking me to come, be a part of this. I had the privilege of teaching a class which we called Wyoming's Political Identity, and it was literally the most enjoyable academic experience I ever had. There were a lot of auditors in there, quite a few gray hairs in fact, but there were about 50 people, and some of my students are here tonight. I haven't had papers from all of you, but I expect you to turn them in. Anyhow, Jillian was one, Kate Pearson I think is here, there you are, and Gail Simmons, and my own niece here, Sarah Mentok was a member of that class, and Cy Thigman was a member of that class. At that time, 92 years old. And I invited Bruce Burns, a local representative, to come into the class one day and explain himself. Talk to members of the class, and he was very gracious, and he came in, and in the middle of his speech, he suddenly identified Cy in the room, and I'll never forget, he pointed at him and he said, you delivered my mother, and you look the same way then. Look, let me get off with it here. I want to describe a little bit about what that class was for, what we did with it, and why we did it, as a means of discussing some other issues with you here tonight, sort of a basic way. It was a class, it was wonderful. It was a class that was supposed to be a safe place to discuss civilly issues of importance to all of us. And as a consequence, we were dignified with the responses of every single member of the class, none of whom were at risk, all of whom had something to say, and every one of whom made a contribution to that class. We did this for 7 weeks, and as Jillian said, we didn't leave anything out, warts and all, the Chinese massacre in Rock Springs, the internment of Japanese Americans in Hart Mountain, right next to my hometown, between Powell and Cody, the Black 14 incident, the death of Matt Shepard, and everything was fair game, and PC was out the window, but civility was in. You can do that. They're not companions in a setting like that. So she is right. The energetic discussions followed, and she's right about trying to keep the temperature down several times in the room, but never uncivilly and never in a discourse that was debasing or insulting. Might not sound familiar right now, but it was a grand summary of things. I asked every one of them to write a paper at the end, giving their definition of what they thought Wyoming's political identity was. I read yours. You got an A. Anyhow, it was a letter. It was a letter to ourselves, and I decided to write one too. It served me right. I'd asked them to do it, so I should do it too, and I did. So I would like to give you a brief summary of what we came up with, what I came up with, or as former Governor Nell Smith. Anybody alive here who remembers former Governor Nell Smith? Nell Smith was the handsomest guy you ever saw. He looked like a movie star, but he murdered the King's English. And so there were a lot of delightful stories about Nell's. I don't think any of his relatives are here either, I hope not. Nell's would always say, now I'm about to give you a brief residue of my experience. And, one time, I've got to divert a little bit, because one time he was having the daughter of the Libby McNeil and Libby Canning people for a steak dinner in Cheyenne, and she was sitting right next to him, and so she was rummaging around for some sort of conversation that might hit the mark with the governor, and they struck on the subject of calf fries, Rocky Mountain oysters. And, oh, there's another one of my students over there, Bernie, for heaven's sake. He gets paid too. Anyhow, so they began to talk about Rocky, and the governor waxed eloquent. It was in his element. And so he described it in some detail, and finally she sort of looked at him quizzically, and she said, well, Governor, are they palatable? And he said, hell no, they're delicious. Well, those things are sort of Wyoming things. We have some uncontested facts about Wyoming. We are, by measurement, the least populated state in the United States. That may be a good thing. We think it is. We are also the state with the cleanest air. We're talking about most of us and most of us. We are about fifth in size by acreage and by square miles. And we are what Dad used to call the land of high altitude and low multitude. After which he was always fond of saying, where the canary bird sings bass. We are a unique state in many ways. And those two things themselves make us unique in this country, but we are also sort of a model of the West in a lot of ways. I'm going to dig into that a little bit. We even wrestled in one class in Laramie about just exactly where the West was. Is it where it's arid? Is it where there's mountains? Is it where it's sparsely populated and rural? Is it where there's public lands? Which of course leaves Texas out to the pleasure of men. And where is it? And one guy who was a policeman, a campus cop at the University of Wyoming, raised his hand and he said, Mr. Simpson, I think I know where the West is. And I said, Kevin, what do you think? Where is it? And he said, where all the cops belong to the NRA. I said, Kevin, we'll think about that. And the point is, we all agreed on one thing, as many interpretations as we might have about where Wyoming fits in this West. We all agreed upon the notion that Wyoming has had and continues to have a very definitive frontier quality, in the sense that frontier is defined as a place where people are unfettered, free, with open space to live in, and broad, untroubled vistas to view. Is that a myth? Or is that a reality? That's nonetheless what we agree on. That idea, that image, is still a part of American mythology. I understand you had Patty Limerick here speaking one time. She's a great friend and a terrific scholar. And I remember in an unguarded moment, she said, I've spent my life fighting against that frontier theory of American development, and frankly, Pete, I never laid a glove on it. I never even knocked it down, much less knocked it out. Well, the class preferred that definition, too. And in many ways, Americans, at least those east of the Mississippi and those west of the Sierras, prefer that vision. In fact, as one friend of mine said, they need it. Let me give you an example, good example. In another election, in 1996, I'm going to mention this one too. In 1996, a TV crew from the east, from ABC, came to Yoder, Wyoming, to film voting in Wyoming. And they went to they filmed a scene of two cowboys riding in the pre-dawn out of the snow when they were going to go feed cattle. And there were two women, a rancher and her rancher's wife and her friend, who were manning the voting place, which was an old school with a pot warmed by a pot-belly stove with a pot of coffee on it. And these two guys came in, and the two girls sort of good-naturedly kidded them and jobbed them about the day and about the voting and who were they going to vote for and what party or he was if they didn't know. And when they got through with their vote, she gave them a good stiff jolt of coffee, and they waved goodbye and rode off into the gathering dawn to feed cattle. Let me tell you, a friend of mine in Connecticut, Tim Prentice, called and said, "My God, are there still places like that in America?" And I said, "You bet." We all say, "You bet." Sure. In fact, that same guy said, "You know, I think we in the East need you more than you need us." I said, "You bet." So it's a good example of the mythology. But is that picture one that gets us anywhere? Or is it the mythology that indeed may hold us back? Don't answer. I'll go to the venerable T.A. Larson, Al Larson, sort of the historian laureate of this state, whose book, The History of Wyoming, is still the definitive work on Wyoming history up through the 1970s. And he, more than probably anybody else, has described Wyoming's development as it relates to who we think we are. And he simply noted, when the buffalo were gone, when the gold petered out, and when the railroad left, the only people who were really attracted to Wyoming were cowboys. And they didn't just come to work, they came to stay. And that, according to Al, was why we love them so. So he said, they're still with us, and like it or not, we have become the cowboy state. Now, it's not the same cowboy that, of course, was the real cowboy at the time, as most historians know. They were itinerant laborers, sometimes with very spotty character. And like Gretel Eric said in her book, they're like a pile of rocks. Everything happens to them. They get rained on, they get snowed on, they get kicked around, they get abused and misused by the animals they care for, but they stick around. That cowboy is not the cowboy we have reconstructed to be this romantic, chivalrous, independent, self-reliant, resourceful, high-quality character that we associate with the Wyoming cowboy, with our cowboy mythology. Now, mythology is not a sinful thing, something we believe in, something we subscribe to, and we subscribe to it in very specific ways. We actually get behind the wheel in our cars, and we drive a car that has a license plate with a bucking bronco on it, and there ain't anybody in this room from Wyoming who don't do that. Yeah, right? Try to take that away. How would you feel? Now you get an idea of when the temperature goes up in my class. Nobody. Yes, and I'm going to introduce some. Sam is not going to escape tonight. But the cowboy myth, are we really all that much agriculture? In fact, if you add agribusiness, agriculture in this state, that whole business system takes a very distant third place to tourism and to the mineral industry, which of course is on the top rung of that ladder. And are we really all that rural? Ranchers by census in this state have decreased from 19,000 ranches, family-owned, in the 1950s to a mere less than 7,000 today. And if we talk about cowboy in political terms, there are only 13 self-identified ranchers in the 90 members of the legislature in Cheyenne. But the cowboy myth, and I'm going to read this because I made it up myself. I don't think it's true. Okay. I think that the cowboy myth is a cross-cultural, I can't believe I actually did this. Matter of fact, this may be too fancy even for me. Let's try. Cross-cultural formulation that constitutes a sort of umbrella that blurs ethnic, economic, and race distinctions and fuses them all into an indigenous common heritage shared by all of us. Think about that. I will. I'll read it. Yeah, I like the sound of it. Okay, let me get it up here where I can really see it. It goes like this. Am I impressed? Okay. The cowboy myth is a cross-cultural formulation that constructs a sort of umbrella that blurs ethnic, economic, and race distinctions and fuses them into an indigenous common heritage shared by all of us. Take some example. This is not an exact good example, but take a young woman who rides like the wind. And in the cowboy culture, often you'll hear a guy say, wow, she rides like a man. Or you might hear somebody talk about an outsider. Well, that outsider, he's a good man, he operates a good outfit, he's a good businessman, what have you. It ain't his fault he was born here. There are certain things that pull us together, and those are some. Now, I want to then, if I can, add a little confusion to that. Are you ready for that? In case this hasn't occurred already in spades. But let's now try to confront our other motto. I've got it on my belt buckle here. It says, Wyoming, the equality state. Holy cats. How does that work with all of these cowboys and that sort of thing? And I just talked about riding like a man, one thing and another. This doesn't make sense. But it's here on my belt, which, of course, I can't see, but still, it's a confusion. And the confusion may come from the fact that we, as Al Larson said in his book, lightning struck Wyoming in 1869 once with the equal rights amendment with voting for women voting privilege. But he says, you know, we've been a good bit behind ever since. He says, we have never had a woman voted to the United States Senate. We have only 12 in the legislature, 11 in the House, and only 1 in the Senate. We had 1 woman governor, 1 congresswoman, and I'm going to diverge again. And you've got to hear this because it just occurred to me. My father was a United States Senator. His name, of course, was Millward. Millward Simpson served with Gail McGee, who was a professor from the University of Wyoming, a Democrat and a Republican. Jack Seeley, who later became treasurer of the state, was a 6th grade teacher, and he asked his students to write an essay about Wyoming, the equality state. And he got one essay that was particularly telling, and he sent a copy to both Gail and Dad. And it was a little 6th grade girl who said, Wyoming is the equality state because it is the only state in the Union that has 2 women senators, Gail McGee and Mildred Simpson. I still have that in the bottom. Let me go on. We're a little behind in other ways as well. In this country, we have the lowest rate of female business ownership and the highest wage gap, 72 cents to it. Now, I'm going to inject politics into this, and I invited Sam Western to class, and that was what I would call an intense session. Sam took us to task for everything from the cowboy myth to the license plate to the quality state and everything in between. And what he had to say, what his main point was he said, we can hold him accountable, I'm quoting him, that this live and let live, tied to the earth, independent cowboy mythology tends to curb development, reduce cooperation, particularly with the feds, and discourage innovation and economic diversification. I hate it. And I disagree with it. But I also kind of agree with it too. You know, we're quick to talk about the feds, but no campaigner can leave that out, by the way. But we sort of have a feeling that federal largesses are due. In fact, we get $1.28 for every dollar we disperse to the feds. Now, we don't want to be called hypocrites for that. We want to be called smart thinkers. And so Sam made me come to grips and write this, I got to read it again, write this following paragraph, if you can stand it, about Wyoming's political identity. Here we go again. Now this, by God, okay. All right. Wyoming's political identity is made up of a fiercely patriotic, often parochial, always cautious constituency that prizes leaders who are plain-spoken, folksy, and accessible. We value tolerance of others, even those from outside, so long as they accede to deep-seated Wyoming values and are accepting of Wyoming's self-image. We prize amateurism in politics, and we despise bureaucracy. As the founding fathers intended it, our representatives in the political realm live with the people they represent and live with the laws they make, and because of that, are more amenable to compromise and political accommodation for the sake of the whole state. We overcome a certain nagging inferiority complex, of course, unless the Cowboys win, with an almost perverse patriotic pride in being able to live in and appreciate the rugged, often hostile environment of which we are a part. We don't like to be ever thought of as mean-spirited, only conservative, and our self-image for all of our protestations is the mythical cowboy, rooted in our history, our landscape, and typical of what we feel to be our special nature as a somehow freer, more independent human being than those consigned to the rest of the globe. I could end it right there, but I'm not going to do that because there are some changes since I wrote that, and I want to address them. One of the comments made by one of our guests, who was the former Governor Dave Friedenthal, is one that haunted me and now is coming to roost in many ways. He made a disturbing comment when he said, he mentioned the legislative opposition to the expansion of Medicaid during this past session. Now that decision, by all measurements, is costing us about $310 grand a day, but it leaves about 20 grand people who are working poor out of insurance. But however you might go for that, opposing arguments were based primarily on fears of the federal government leaving Wyoming in the lurch if the funds ran short. Now that is a legitimate Wyoming argument. In other words, not keeping their promises to us. But couched in those arguments were remarks about the distasteful aura of Obamacare and the policies of this, quote, liberal administration. In other words, ideology had begun to creep in, and in many ways had trumped practicality and pragmatism. Friedenthal called it the new, and I'll quote it, nationalization of Wyoming politics, a retreat from the practical, engaged, pragmatic approaches were so much a part of Wyoming's long-standing political identity. And I'm sorry to say, ladies and gentlemen, that that long-standing political identity is being challenged by other outside influences, not the feds in this case, but outside money, big money, coming in through funnels that represent big PACs and 501c4 social services, dark money sources and organizations. I'll name them: the Liberty Group, Republican Free Choice, the Brophy PACs, and others. Old-time legislators like my friend and former House Speaker Tom Lubnow, they worry that funds increased exponentially or unaccounted sources, and the more expensive and fiercer the campaigns, the more the civility and accommodation declines. And old veteran Michael Von Flatter observed that successful politics, and I'll quote him, is the art of compromise. And I think that that art is not appreciated by groups with ideological agendas. End of quote. Lastly, and I'll make one more comment, an old friend of mine I served with from Sublette County, Bob Budd said, and you know, the hitching post burned down. Well, he really meant something there. The place where you bonded together, the place where you lived and associated, the place where you hashed out real problems in the bar, or at dinner, or in the hallway, or in your opponent's room. You talked through jams and difficulties and problems, and you were all shackled with the same leg irons. Nobody could vote maybe. So the glue has come apart in some ways. But I'm here to say to this group particularly, that need not be the future. And that's where you come in. PRBRC is what Ed Hersker said 3 decades ago, and I'll quote that. The PRBRC makes a major contribution toward the betterment of our Wyoming state, and its grassroots, task-specific review of projects and policies make a difference for Wyoming and all of its citizens. That's it. talking. I'm convinced the Wyoming way will transcend outside pressures and tend on shaping Wyoming to an outside image of big donors and well-heeled influence peddlers. But we need to be wary. We need to be on the watch. In fact, I'm going to use a metaphor here. We need to be like you, smart, wary border collies, watching the herd, finding out where the dangers are, pointing them out, and willing to defend them. You can be the defenders, but who are going to be the visionaries? Who are going to be the people who break the century-long cycle of boom and bust and plan boldly for a future that we should have seen coming 20 years ago here in this state? All of that, at least. Sam Western one time said, again antagonizing me and everybody in the class, that we become complacent. He said the mineral industry has paved roads, built schools, and paid for a large chunk of our Wyoming way of life, and that we in fact have become so complacent that we don't really hold a stake in our own society. Now, he stopped short of saying something like an income tax would sober us up, but one thing is true. We are about to face some very painful choices in this state. We're going to have to define what our, quote, quality of life really is and what it will be. Will it be bigger classroom sizes in the schools? Will it be less public health care and more home cures and personal attention to prevention? That's not a bad idea. Will it be pared down university and community college curricula and fewer majors? Will it be reduced city and county services? Whatever it will be, we need both vision and far-sighted leadership. I think that sounds like an eagle. soaring over the top of the landscape, viewing it, assessing it, and deciding where to go. So, I guess what I'm saying is, you're going to have to be flying border collies. You're going to have to be the vision and the leadership because you have institutional credibility, you have the talent, you have the voice, and I hereby bequeath to you the mantle of leadership. The Simpson boys are done. We'll look with great confidence and no little comfort to you for our future. The great cathedral at Notre Dame had a scrawled parchment on the door in the 12th century that said, "The world tomorrow belongs to those who bring it the greatest hope." You're the bringers of hope. God bless you.